I think initially, why I have time to pull myself together, it'd be great if everyone could introduce themselves as to who they are. So I'm Hannah Deacon. I'm a patient advocate. I started campaigning because of my son Alfie, who spent many, many months, many, many weeks of his life in hospital. I was firefighting. I was a full-time carer, and I didn't want to do that anymore. So I got up and did something about it, and I'm very pleased to say he's just celebrated over 2.5 years seizure-free because of medical cannabis. So I'm now able to work and do these things and continue to campaign because I absolutely understand what it's like to be desperate, to want your child to live, to watch your family fall apart. I did all of that, and now I'm not having to do it anymore. So I want to use my voice to try and help other people like me. So that's me. If you could introduce yourself, sir.
I will. Hi, I'm Mike Barnes. I'm a neurologist, or was a neurologist. I think I describe myself as a cannabis physician these days, which is exciting. And I worked in cannabis for about 20 years, helped Hannah get the license for Alfie, set up the Medical Cannabis Clinician Society and latterly the Cannabis Industry Council, and worked in cannabis, and that's great. That's me.
Hello, my name is Chase Gouthro. I made the documentary that we just watched. Yeah, we're very happy to be here. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for having us.
I'm Sydney Anderson. I'm the sister of Nicholas in the documentary.
And I'm Jen Anderson, and this was my story and my patient's story that you just watched. I'm a family doctor from Canada.
Thank you for being here. Right, so we're going to have a chat now, a Q&A session, a bit of a talk, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end for people to ask questions. So it'd be great if you want to ask questions, you'll be able to do that at the end. So I think initially we'll just start off talking about the film. What compelled you to make the film, Jen, and how did you meet Chase, and how did it all come together?
Well, initially, I never thought I would be giving out authorizations for cannabis. It was not even on my radar, but about 6 years ago, after I had success with my son, people started noticing, and so I had a clinic that kind of came to me and said, can you please see these kids? These kids are coming in. I said, no, absolutely not. I'm not going to be the cannabis doctor for kids. But a few months later, and after talking and experiencing a few more things, I came back to them and I said, okay, I will see the kids that have failed everything. And so I started doing that, and I'm getting into how I met Chase, but the leader of the clinic, her name was Jan, and we started seeing these kids, and many of the kids in the film were some of our first patients. And they started getting better, and we started watching this, and the educators at the clinic, and we always were so excited to see the kids come in because the letters they would write, like the parents, and just the stories were incredible. So we started thinking this needs to be, these patient stories need to get out there. So after a couple years, Jan actually knew Chase and set us up with a meeting, and we just started to brainstorm and think about how we could put together a story that would help other people. So this was the end result of it.
And Chase, have you made a film like this before? And what sort of challenges did you face when doing it? And did it worry you making a film like this, more interestingly?
Yeah, this is kind of my first foray into documentary work. I had worked in journalism in Canada for 8 or 9 years, and yeah, when Jan introduced me to Jen, I was just kind of blown away by her story and how far she had come, and then I went and spent some time with her family and met Nicholas and Sydney and Zachary, and just really felt like this was a story that needed to be told, because I thought, this is really going to be the catalyst for progress in that industry, as hearing people's stories, hearing the success stories, and then that would influence research and things like that. So, yeah, that's kind of what really made me want to do it. And as far as worries, I didn't have I didn't have any worries in it. I just thought this was a story that needed to be told.
Good. I want to ask you that question, Jen. Did you feel vulnerable? Because I know from my own experience, I had to run a campaign to help my son have his prescription, but that made me feel incredibly vulnerable. And I still do at times. I have to put my life in the media, and that's tough because it's my family. But it's really important to do it to make change. And I think it's really, I don't know if anyone's heard of Brené Brown talking about the call to courage. I watched that the other day and it really resonated with me, and it talks about having to be vulnerable to be brave. And I think that doing what you've done is incredibly brave, but did you feel vulnerable, and did that make you feel like you didn't want to do it?
Absolutely. Actually, in Brené Brown, I did go through all of her books in this whole process. I felt vulnerable on many levels. As a parent, as a doctor, I'm a family doctor. I definitely have gotten a lot of hate from the physician community, which is really hard sometimes. And have experienced everything that you just mentioned. Yeah. So I think when we first started talking about the documentary, I didn't really think about the reach it would have. But as we started showing it, every once in a while, I still have fears about sharing our story.
It's tough, isn't it? But thank you for doing it, because the only way we make change is by telling the patient stories. And I think what's really compelling is watching your film, and that's why it upset me, because I know that there's parents in the room here that I will call lifelong friends because I've met them, because they're all going through the same thing that I am and was, and actually much worse for them because they're having to pay privately, but we can move on to that. But I think the stories are the same over and over and over again, the before and the after, the effect on the family. And I think that is so powerful, and we can't continue to call it anecdote. It's real, it's life, and I think having this film is, it shows that, and that's wonderful. So thank you so much. I wanted to move on, if that's okay, to talk about how Nicholas's epilepsy affected your family, because I think we always talk about the patient, don't we? We always talk about the patient and what the patient's going through and how they're feeling. And obviously that's very important. We must do that. But I think it's very overlooked, the effect on mum and dad's relationship and on siblings. And I'd like to explore that a bit more, if you're happy to talk about the effects that had on you and how things have changed since he's been better.
Yes, it definitely affects the whole family. I think, early on, he was 3 when his seizures got really bad, and definitely was a factor in breaking up my relationship. After that point, just spending so much time in hospital, I ended up quitting my family practice and just working emergency, just because I could go straight from the emergency to the hospital and go back and forth. It was traumatizing, and I don't think that you realize how traumatizing it is at the time. But then after we'd been seizure-free and hadn't been in hospital now for 4 years, but even early on, you worry and you panic and you kind of look for the next crash. I ended up bringing Nicholas into hospital last spring because he fell and he needed stitches. And I never even thought about it affecting me, but I brought him to the ER, and we walked past the resus room, and I started panicking, and I realized, oh my goodness, I still struggle, My kids definitely have had their own struggles, and do you want to talk a little bit about yours? This is Sydney. She was 5, 6 when all this started.
I've definitely realized a big effect on our family. I have struggled with a lot of PTSD towards sirens and ambulances and a lot of flashing lights due to waking up and finding my brother and a bunch of firefighters and paramedics in our house. And even with Zachary, he doesn't normally talk about how much it's affected him, but in this documentary, I think we heard a lot about how much he worries about his brother, and I've committed myself to staying in Canada and staying in Winnipeg to just be there for Nicholas, and I never want to not be there if anything happened. So that's definitely affected me and affected the way that I think, and I still worry about him every day, and even now, especially after watching our documentary, that was only the second time after, I want to say maybe 6 months since we've seen the documentary, which was still a lot to take in, just watching the whole documentary, because when you're 6 years old and your brother's going through all this, you don't really think or don't really understand what's going on until it's all laid out in front of you, like this documentary.
Thank you. I really appreciate you talking about that. Thank you. I think you're absolutely right as well, and I know again from my experience the worry you have about siblings. I mean, my daughter's 8 and her brother's 11, and yet she's older than him, and she looks after him, and she's his carer already, And I think that, as a parent, that's really tough. It's really tough having to accept that your children's lives are not what you planned. We all have a plan for our lives, don't we? We all think this is how it's going to be, and then when it's not, it's a big kick. And it's wonderful that you're able to talk about it, because I think that's really important, is talking about it and sharing with your mum, and you obviously do that, so it's great to see. I don't know the sort of setup in Canada, but do you get any support in Canada as a family as well? I mean, is that something that you've had to fight for too? Because I think, again, talking about the families that I know in the UK and myself, cannabis medicine is just a part of what we have to fight for every day. Social care, social worker, respite, counselling, stories of people being told that their child is diagnosed with epilepsy that may kill them in a hospital corridor and told them to go home. I mean, there's so much trauma and grief, and there isn't enough support or recognition for what we go through as families. And I'd be interesting to understand, as you're a doctor as well, did you access that sort of support and help, or was that tough as well?
It was very tough. I think as I started working with families, I started noticing that we all were on our own little islands and nobody was connecting us, because as a physician, you can't connect the patients. But I just started realizing as well that when I shared my story with my patients, because I felt like that was always super important to just let them know that I actually knew what they were going through, I started healing my own trauma, and I didn't think about it till later that was part of my therapy journey. And so this September, 2 months ago, we actually started a pediatric research clinic at our Child Health Research Center in Winnipeg. And the long-term plan is to help bring families together to help access resources. So the answer right now is that there isn't a lot. Everything's just, if you find it, great. If you don't, well, you don't know it's not there. But it's my hope that this research clinic will bring together resources for all the families that I look after.
That's great. That's great to hear. And that's, again, why, in comparison, why we set up MedCam Support, because when I went to Holland, when I took my son to Holland, I felt like I was the only mother in the world with a child with epilepsy, which I know sounds crazy because I'm not, but that's how I felt. I felt very alone, and that's the point of setting up MedCam Support. And actually, we are, again, talking about research, going to be launching a research program soon, very, very soon, collecting data of all our members, which is really exciting. So yeah, that's really important. I want to go on now to talk about, once you'd found that this worked for Nicholas, how did you deal with it with your colleagues, with your peers? Did you deal with it head on, or did you, like, as you said, you didn't want to be known as the cannabis doctor? I mean, what changed that? How did you move forward? And, what sort of conversations were you having with these people?
Well, I think I touched a little bit on it in the documentary. I didn't really want to, say everything in the documentary because, I did kind of fight for it. And it's one of those things that makes you a little bit vulnerable. The Friday night that I picked up this bottle of Charlotte's Web from my friend, I was told that it might work, like a CBD might work for my child, but I had to go find a family doctor that was an expert in epilepsy and cannabis, and they couldn't help me do that. So, I put out sort of on my personal blog that I was interested in trying cannabis. And one of my girlfriends that I grew up with said, you know what, we have this bottle, it's not working for my son. It's hemp, do you want to try it? So I went and paid, I think, $200 for this little tiny bottle. And I didn't know what I was doing, but I gave him 1 drop, and he slept all night. He had been seizing all night, every night before that. And I was up all night, every night, watching him. And so he slept. And, the second night he slept again, third night. And by Monday, he was a different kid. So I had told neurology, well, I will call you and let you know if I start it. So I called them on Monday, Tuesday. I had already quit my practice, so I was busy closing that. And I said, okay, I started it. It's great. Like, he's a different kid. He's alive. He's awake. He's sleeping all night. He's not having seizures. And what I was met with was, who's authorizing it for you? And I said, well, nobody, it's hemp. They're like, well, no, that's still cannabis. You need someone to authorize. I'm like, well, who? And they're like, well, we can't help you with that. And so they said, basically, because I'm a colleague, they're like, well, we'll give you 24, 48 hours. You have to find someone, or we're going to have to contact Child Protective Services. And I'm in my clinic trying to take care of my patients. And I was like, well, if I stop it, he could die, because he's having 3-4 seizures an hour before this. And sudden unexpected death in epilepsy is a real thing. And the more you seize, the higher chance there is that that you could have a seizure and die. So I said, he could die if I stopped it. And they said, well, yeah, he might. And I think at that point, it just made me go, no, that's not okay. So I refused to stop it. I called everybody and begged, everybody, to help me, and everybody said no. And then one of my colleagues that I worked with in emergency, she's a family doctor, she's like, well, I can tell that it's helping. She goes, she'd never authorized cannabis before, and she's like, well, I'll help you. What do we have to do? And so she signed the papers, and I gave that to neurology, and they were happy with that. So that's sort of how we got started, but it was a struggle, and I definitely could have been in huge trouble.
Yeah, and I think you could have done with people just supporting you, and I think that's the thing. It's a very tough time, and you're having to fight all the time to actually just be heard, as you say, and be seen. And that, again, in your film, you talk about people wanting to be seen. And that's so important. When you've got a sick child, you just want people to listen to how you feel. And that's really important. I'd like to bring in Professor Barnes here, if you don't mind. I think just talk about if you don't mind, talk about your experience with epilepsy within your family, because I think it's very little known. And I think it's an important part of who you are. And I want you said you'd be happy to talk about it, so
I did,
I would like him to.
Rationally. I must have been drunk at the time or something.
Probably.
And my sister, who had severe epilepsy and cerebral palsy, very severely affected. She didn't walk, talk, eat, was incontinent, had multiple seizures daily, generalized seizures, focal seizures, absent seizures, and interesting, I'll be lighthearted for a moment, called salam seizures, which I used as a small child called salami seizures. And for those that don't know, they're seizures that you do that. And at the same time, she sprayed her food out, bless her. And this was great fun as a 10-year-old, because I was 5 years older than her. And I could tell they were coming, but guests around the table couldn't. And so she had one of these seizures and sprayed the assembled company with food, etc., which I've still found was very funny as a 10-year-old. But this was in the 60s. So obviously cannabis wasn't talked about then. People didn't know about it. Obviously it was known about, because it's been described for about 5,000 years as an anticonvulsant. But it wasn't something in the general ether, as it were. She was on phenytoin and phenobarbital, which are pretty awful drugs as for a child. But I think the relevance to this, I don't think I've got into cannabis because of that. Probably Freud or Jung would have a word to say about it, but that's what's knowingly happened. But I have. And I think, just to come back to the situation today, it seems to me that the neurology community, or the medical community, but more specifically for this, the pediatric neurology community, are implacably against this, for reasons I simply do not understand. If you look at that film, which is a brilliant film, very moving film, why in God's name do some of these people not embrace this? I find it mysterious. They're not going to listen to intellectual argument, they're not going to listen to any argument except treating it as a pharmaceutical, double-blind, placebo-controlled argument. I think what we ought to do is much more activism. I'm sorry to say, this is getting very personal, but I'll carry on. My mother, bless her, it was the days before there was any respite care, decided that for a respite, she needed respite, my sister. So she went to the mayor's office, this was in Walthamstow in East London, and had a meeting with the mayor and said, I'm not leaving your office until you provide me with respite care. And she sat there, and ahead of her time, she brought the press with her. And that was incredibly embarrassing. I was a 14-year-old boy at the time. That was on the front page of the local paper. But that showed you what you can do. And when she left that office, there was respite care provided. And that was remarkable. And I think that's what we ought to do, is go to the paediatric neurologist, sit in the office and say, I'm not moving from this office until you agree to prescribe cannabis for my child. Bring the press with you and do something about it. Because these ignorant buggers called paediatric neurologists are not going to move until something dramatic happens. And that's what we need to do, is much more activism. Sadly, it shouldn't be necessary, but it is necessary. And I would like that to happen. And I like the British Paediatric Neurology Association to hang their heads in shame. And I like to publicly challenge them, I've done before, to sit in a room like this and tell us why they're not doing it. Why aren't you doing it? There is no intellectual argument they can mount, which is why they don't come. But I'd like to challenge them again to come. Go on film and come and tell us why you're being so bloody awkward. So there you go.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you talking about your personal experience, because I think it's really important that you share that. I know you probably don't agree with me, but I'm telling you what to do. Okay. I want to talk to you a bit about what you're prescribing, Jen, because you talk about CBD in the film. But a lot of our children in the UK are using CBD and THC. Is that what you see? Do you start with CBD? Do you ever use THC, or do you not use THC? I'd be interested to understand how you play things.
So in Canada, our CBD products still have THC in them. And so I've kind of taken advantage of that. I don't draw attention to it, but definitely I think it makes a big difference. So usually what we'll do is start a dose of the CBD, and then add in THC if we maximize the CBD dose, but usually there's a good dose of THC in there already.
That's interesting, thank you. So I think we need to talk a bit more about the film and what your plans are for the film. So where are you next? Where are you showing it? Let's listen to more plans.
Yeah, so the movie was finished, I think we finished filming about this time last year, and then it was complete by the end of the year. And we've just been doing film festivals, mostly through Canada, and it's done, thankfully, very well there. And yeah, now I think that these are the types of audiences that can really affect change. So these are the types of audiences we're trying to get it out in front of. So conferences and things like that. But of course, the more people that see it, the better. So that's kind of next steps as well, is getting it on a streaming platform or something like that. Nothing's set in stone yet, but as large an audience as possible, I think needs to see this. So
with your prescribing, so now you're prescribing cannabis-based products to lots of children, I'm sure. In relation to obviously here, as I'm sure you've heard today, the law has changed. And it's something I want to say actually, because the law changed in 2018 because of children, because of parents like me who ran campaigns and we changed the law. And I think that's the one group of people that have been left behind. So, we've talked on the panels about doctors prescribing, and there being 22,000 people prescribed in the UK. Most of them are adults. Well, all of them are adults, apart from maybe 50. And it makes me very sad and angry, actually, that the law was changed by children with epilepsy, and they're the one group of people that are left behind in this country. And that's why we've got to do so much more to remember that, to do something about it, to ensure that there's safe prescribing, that there's safe products available, that it's not ridiculously expensive. Because as Emily alluded to in the panel this morning, she's paying £1,300 a month, and she's still coming to people like me for advice on dosing, which is wrong. But the issues are because, as Mike said, the 2 doctors that were prescribing one of them was reported to the GMC. So there's been an active lobby against people prescribing for children in this country, which I think is utterly disgraceful when children are sent home with nothing else to try. And I think it's weird. I don't understand why a clinician would send home a child to die rather than trying cannabis medicine, even if it's unlicensed. I don't understand that. So I'm interested to understand what is the mood like in Canada, let's say, for prescribing for children for cannabinoids? Is it still difficult?
It's very difficult. In Canada, any physician can authorize cannabis, but the different provinces have different licenses. So I'm only licensed in my province, so I can't see a patient in BC or a different province. So there are provinces that don't have anyone that is authorizing for kids, and I get numerous emails every week from families, and they make me cry. Alberta, for example, has forbidden family doctors from authorizing for kids, and they're reaching out to me, and I can't because I don't have a license there. But also physicians from Alberta, like pediatricians, reach out, and they criticize me, and they say, what are you doing giving cannabis to kids? There's no research. I get so many messages. It's really disheartening. So that's, you get that in Alberta. BC, is kind of in the middle. And all the other provinces are kind of different shades of gray. In Manitoba, I think what happened with us is that no one was authorizing, and I was the first one. And, we just sort of did things with my son. So we started seeing the patients in the film, actually, because they're the longest patients. And then with my son, we started getting it into the school. And we actually just started writing protocols for them to have cannabis in school, just like any other medication. And then as I saw my patients, we would copy it into their school division. And then we just sort of worked like that. And then all of a sudden, we'd done so much that no one could reverse it. And then just like you, I started realizing that, the medical cannabis section in Canada was really, they weren't making a lot. So now they're focused more on recreational. Because recreational cannabis is legal for adults in Canada since 2018. So a lot of the government and politics, are not recognizing that there's a need for medical cannabis. So what I started doing was realizing that if you put the kids' faces out there, and I mean, my son is the only kid's face I can, put out there, but, you get in front of politicians, you put Nicholas's face there, and you tell the story as a mom and a parent, and literally you just watch their faces change. And at the end, they're like, what can I do to help you? And I did that so many times. I spoke to Parliament last year, and every single person, it was a Zoom call because of COVID, they all waited and specifically asked what they could do and thanked me for sharing my story, because they said if I hadn't shared the story of my son, they wouldn't have realized that there was a need for medical cannabis. Many people don't even realize that kids can use it. And so, I think kids are the pathway for everybody to be able to use it.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think we do have to finish up, but I think I just wanted to come on to that. The adult legislation in Canada has not helped chronically ill patients who need prescriptions. And I think that is one thing that does really concern me. And I know it's very, in the UK, it's very topical and it's very important. And we must have everyone being able to access their medicine in the way that they would like. I massively think that, but I also think that we have to separate it out as well, is that there are people like Alfie who, my son, he will always need care. And when I'm not here, I need to know that he has access to a medicine that keeps him safe and that it can be prescribed. And I think, all the parents here share the same thing. And I think that's something that we're striving for always, is that we want clinician-led prescribing. We want companies to do research. We want this to be a medicine. And then the other issues around cannabis are absolutely valid and need to be dealt with, but it's a separate issue. And I think it can become very grey, as you say, when legislation changes. So, hopefully we'll learn from that in the UK. But finally, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for showing your film. Thank you for all of you to be here. Sorry, Mags. Oh, I need someone to direct me. Thank you for being here and sharing your story and opening your hearts, because it's really personal but really important. And thank you. And I do agree with you. If we keep fighting and we keep sharing our stories, that things will change. So thank you. And we'll have a Q&A quickly before we finish up.
You're
not going to start us rioting again, are you?
Yeah,
he's just about to retire, so he's just like, riot everyone, we don't care.
He's
not really retiring, he's slowing down.
I'm going to ask the first question, which is a bit odd from the panel. But come someone who's got a collective wisdom in the room, why do paediatric neurologists just hate this medicine? There's any coherent intellectual or otherwise argument. There's lots of conspiracy theories, but let's hear those as well. But why? Why, in God's name, do they are so antagonistic to it? Someone tell me, please.
Obviously, this isn't probably true, but what I believe is, from the stigma that cannabis already has, and from the psychological effects that it supposedly can cause, maybe they believe, one, that they don't like it anyway, because they've been trained to believe it's evil. Two, maybe they believe because young kids are more susceptible to maybe the psychological effects more from THC than CBD, let's be clear. So maybe that's their argument, that it could cause those psychological effects, which, as we all know, is very, very rare.
Yeah, that could be. I mean, we're speculating, aren't we? Yeah, but there's no answer because we don't know.
I was just going to jump in there. I think you're right, but I think what we have to remember here is we're not talking about neurotypical children. We're talking about children who have short life expectancies, who are having hundreds of seizures. We're dealing with unique people here, and I think it needs a unique solution. And to say, well, we don't know the long-term impact of THC is a cop-out, because actually my son had intravenous steroids, intravenous lorazepam, intravenous everything, chloral hydrate, never had an RCT in chloral hydrate in children, yet it's given out like Smarties to make them go to sleep. So I think that's what we have to remember is, I agree with you, I think you're right, but we have to, it's wrong, it's a wrong opinion, and I think you're right, though, I think you're absolutely right, that's what they fear it.
Yes, it's working, yeah. This isn't, well, my son was a child when he had uncontrolled seizures. He's now 19 and been seizure-free for 2 years, yesterday, on Bedrolite. He has an adult neurologist who wanted to prescribe and applied for funding, and on the NHS, yeah, he's got a private prescription, but we can't afford it. And they just suddenly changed their mind. And the reason they gave was safety, that they're worried about the safety of it. He's been on it for 2 years, he's been on it for 4 years, not suffering any side effects, and is seizure-free. And on there are no other drugs he can have, and they said this because they were causing seizures because of his genetic variant. And so I think the block is I'm not sure it's to do with neurologists wanting to prescribe or not. I think they're being stopped from prescribing. I think there's something else going on. And
I think the words open the floodgates has been used before, and I think that's the thing. If you start prescribing and these children start getting better, I mean, gosh, maybe everyone with children with epilepsy might want cannabis and they won't want all the other drugs. Who knows? That's the issue.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Hannah. As I mentioned before, education is a real issue because of all the stigma, but a lot of it is down to the pharmaceutical companies lobbying. It is a lot of that, and I know I've mentioned this before, but I just want to mention it again because that is a massive barrier. They have so much money that literally they can stop anything that they want. So that for me, I see that as a huge barrier for most people within the profession. One, the education, and two, the lobbying against anything natural medicine, because it won't make them money. And that's simply as I see it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And just to put a number on that, there's 25% less alcohol consumed when cannabis is legalized. That's a different discussion, I know. 25% less tobacco consumed, and 25%, it's easy to remember the statistics, and 25% less pharmaceutical medicine. And 25% to the bottom right-hand corner of your spreadsheet is a lot of money.
Sydney, please.
One of the things I was going to say was that a lot of this is based off of research. I know at the time when my brother when my mom started wanting to do medical cannabis on my brother, it was one of the main reasons was there's not enough research. But in this time now, I don't think anyone after seeing this documentary can say there's not enough research, because what other research do you need to see that this has helped so many kids? And obviously there hasn't been enough research done on it, and we don't know maybe some of the more bad side effects, but this documentary might lead to some people or having more research done on it. What more research do you need than this documentary and showing all these kids?
You're absolutely right, Sydney. Thank you. And I remember a doctor saying to me once, who was from Canada, he said, if you have a child having hundreds of seizures and you give them cannabis and it stops, that's evidence. And it is. It's evidence.
Hi there. Comment and a question. I mean, the first thing, just to respond to Mike's point, it doesn't really seem that within the framework of medicine within the UK, US, Canada, that there is any incentive for practitioners to rock the boat. None at all. Yes. To challenge upwards. Paying your rent, paying your mortgage, that's, getting up in the morning, that's hard enough for most doctors, for most people in the NHS. I think that's one thing to really say. The second thing is more that I wanted to really ask. The prevalence of epilepsy, autism, is higher within POC communities, especially across the areas of socioeconomic deprivation, poor families. The state of medical care and medical support for those families in the UK is bad enough as it is. My question really, and it's one for the mums, one for Hannah and Jen, in terms of what we can do to provide support to families within those communities, like what can we do? Because I know that from my own experience speaking to mums about cannabis, like we can come off as a bit of a weird stoner. And that's the thing. You want to be able to give the best support, but at the end of the day, we're a mixture of lay experts and expert patients. Like, how can we give help to that section of society that needs it the most, which is the poor working class?
That's a pretty broad question. I'm trying to think about what we've done in Canada. I really believe it takes all members of a community to help these families. I used to try to talk to my colleagues, and I thought, well, if I share at conferences, medical conferences, or I host grand rounds and things like that, then I'll make lots of progress. I actually found that talking to parent groups, talking to teachers and educators and just anybody that would listen really helped, because they would open doors to other things. So, for example, the way we got things in the schools was me reaching out and going to the schools and educating the schools. So part of the answer to your question is trying to educate the people around you, because the more people that know a person that benefits, the better it will be. And you don't know if the person beside you is going to open a doorway to help other people, right? The first part of your question was related to physicians and why they don't do this. I honestly, the amount of, even in Canada, the amount of hate and the amount of animosity towards physicians like myself is incredible. I do this because of my son. I actually work emergency to pay the bills. This is what I do to try to advocate. But if I didn't have my son, I wouldn't have the motivation to do this, because there's just so much backlash. And I see why my physician colleagues that don't have a personal cause, they would never want to do this at all.
I don't understand that. But you're quite right. I mean, I thought, call me old-fashioned, and I thought doctors came into being to act in the best interests of their patients, not in the best interests of their career or their mortgage. And some are the system now in the NHS pulls down those who are prepared to innovate. And that, I think, is a big source of the difficulty.
Yeah. Just to jump in on that as well, I think this community can support our support groups. So MedCan Support was created to support children and families, have somewhere for people to talk. At the moment, that's been running for 2.5 years as a volunteer organisation. We do not have any long-term support from anyone, and that's something that could be changed within the industry, that organisations, anyone that wants to support families like mine, they can do that by helping these patient groups. And again, we won't have a good sector without patient groups, without advocacy. All of those things are really important, and they can't happen forever as a volunteer. So that's something to think about. And I want to very quickly just be a bit political, because I don't see anyone, and I've spent 4 years going to Parliament, and I've made friends who are members of Parliament. I am very lucky to have had a lot of support from people in Parliament from across the House, but I don't see anyone that represents me in the government at the moment. There is no one that knows what it's like to have a child that's very seriously ill, that has to fight for services and fight to be seen. And I think we need to really think about the people that are in our parliaments and who they represent, because at the moment I don't see that. And I think when we want to make change in our society, we really need to think about politics and the people that are standing in our constituencies, and do they understand who we are? Do they understand the society issues within our constituencies? All those sorts of things. So we really need to think about that as well. We can't just keep advocating. We need to think about who we put into power as well.
Well, you answered most of what my question was going to be, so just to kind of extend on it a little bit, MedCan is essentially what I was going to ask about, but would it have been helpful for mothers such as yourselves to have someone with a bit more extensive experience using cannabis help you monitor dosage and things like that, whereas as GPs and other doctors aren't quite up there with it yet, would it have been helpful having someone with that sort of experience kind of help manage and explain dosage and different methods of using?
Well, that's why I took my son to Holland in 2017, because I went to see a paediatric neurologist who knew what to do, and Alfie did get worse first. I remember starting it on. He carried on having seizures all the time. And I remember saying to the doctor, we need to stop this, it's making him worse, it's making him worse. And she said, just wait, just be calm. She gave me a titration thing to follow, and it got better. And I am grateful to that doctor every single day that she took the time to see my son in Holland, and that she took the time to support me, and she was wonderful. We have got a big, as I've said, the law was changed by children in this country, and there's no doctors apart from 2, and they're not prescribing. It's all private, it's all too much money. there is so many issues for people in this country, and it's wrong that if you are prescribed, you're having to go to each other to talk about dosing. We should have doctors that understand that, but it's not been made easy for them because of organisations like the BPNA who are trying to shut it down. And that's the problem, and we have to change things. And that does take collaboration. You know, I've reached out to the BPNA and said, can I sit down and talk to you? Can we collaborate? Can we try and work this through so we're all happy? And they don't want to talk to anyone. And that's the problem. They don't actually want to solve the issue, and we need to, but you know, it's going to take time. But what I do know is talking to other parents who are in the same boat really helps. It doesn't mean it doesn't solve the issue. It makes you feel seen, and that's what the point of MedCan support was.
I just want to say I want to acknowledge all the effort you mothers have gone through for helping legalise cannabis in this country, and say thank you so much for your effort. I think it's time for the rest of us. It's time for us to stand here with you and help you. It's time for us to be there for you now.
Thank you. And thank you, Jen. Thank you, Sydney. Thank you, Chase. Thank you, Mike. Thanks for being here. Thanks, everyone.